Atari versus Amusement World. In 1981, Atari was at the top of the arcade world thanks to Asteroids, but almost immediately imitators appeared, and one in particular sparked one of the first major legal battles in gaming history. A small company called Amusement World released Meteors, a game that looked suspiciously similar to Asteroids. Players flew a triangle ship, blasted floating rocks, and racked up points. Sounds familiar? Atari thought so too, and they quickly filed the lawsuit claiming copyright infringement. This case was groundbreaking because it asked a new question: can you actually copyright gameplay? Atari's lawyers argued that Meteors stole not just the idea, but the feel and style of Asteroids. But the court didn't see it that way. The judge ruled that while the games were undeniably similar, basic mechanics like flying a ship and shooting rocks weren't protectable. They were considered ideas, not expressions of creativity. Only the specific art, sound, or unique elements could be copyrighted. The ruling was a major loss for Atari, but it set a precedent that still shapes gaming today. You can't copyright a genre or core mechanics. Without this case, modern clones or even whole genres might not exist the way they do now. Nintendo versus Atari. In the late 1980s, Nintendo dominated the home console market with the NES, and their secret weapon was the 10 NES lockout chip. Every cartridge had to contain a matching key chip, meaning only games officially licensed by Nintendo could run. This gave Nintendo enormous control, forcing publishers to sign restrictive licensing deals. But Atari, though a subsidiary, Tengen, wanted to bypass the system. At first, Tengen tried conventional reverse engineering, but they couldn't crack the code, so their lawyers took an unusual route. They obtained the 10 NES source code directly from the US Copyright Office. Claiming it was for legal research, engineers then used that copy to clone the chip and release unlicensed cartridges like Tetris and RBI Baseball. Just like today, Nintendo quickly sued, accusing Atari of copyright infringement and unfair competition. The courts agreed. Judges ruled that Tengen's clone was built on a code acquired under false pretense, making it an illegal copy. In 1992, the Federal Circuit upheld Nintendo's victory, forcing Tengen to pull its unlicensed games from the shelves. The ruling reinforced Nintendo's grip on the NES library and showed that while reverse engineering could sometimes be legal, crossing the line into misappropriation would not stand in the court. Sega versus Accolade. In the early 1990s, Sega was booming with the Genesis, and they used a licensing system similar to Nintendo's. Publishers had to pay Sega for the right to release games, but Accolade, a smaller company, wanted in without giving Sega a cut. Instead of signing a deal, they decided to reverse engineer the Genesis hardware. By analyzing how the console booted games, Accolade figured out a way to create unlicensed titles that worked just like the official ones. Sega wasn't happy. They argued that Accolade violated copyright by copying portions of Sega's startup code to make their games compatible. In 1991, Sega took them to court. At first, Sega actually won an injunction, temporarily blocking Accolade's games from sale. But the fight didn't end there. On appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled in Accolade's favor, saying that reverse engineering for the sake of compatibility was protected under fair use. This ruling had massive implications. It meant developers could legally study and adapt systems without automatically being guilty of infringement. Without this case, software like emulators, cross-platform ports, and even compatibility layers might not have been possible. Sega lost the battle, but the industry gained a critical legal safeguard. Sony versus Connectix. By 1999, the PlayStation was the king of the console world, but a small software company called Connectix suddenly gave gamers a way to play PS1 discs without buying Sony's hardware. Their product, the Virtual Game Station, was a computer program that emulated the PlayStation. It even ran games more smoothly on some Macs and later on Windows PC. For the fans, this was revolutionary. For Sony, it was a direct threat. Sony sued, claiming Connectix had illegally copied portions of the PlayStation BIOS during development. They also argued that emulators tarnished the PlayStation brand. But on February 10, 2000, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a landmark ruling. Connectix reverse engineering was protected under fair use, and emulation itself was not illegal. The courts dismissed Sony's trademark arguments, noting that the VGS was a transformative product. Sony couldn't stop the VGS in the courts, but they found another way. In 2001, they purchased the rights to the software outright and immediately discontinued it. Gamers lost access, but the precedents remained. This case was historic. It confirmed that creating an emulator wasn't automatically piracy. It established legal grounds that continues to protect software preservation and emulator development today. Enjoying the video? Make sure to like and subscribe for more. Sony versus Bleem. Right after losing the Connectix, Sony faced another emulator battle. This time against a scrappy startup called Bleem. Founded in 1999, Bleem sold a commercial emulator that let players run PlayStation games on a PC, and later even on the Sega Dreamcast. What made Bleem unique was its ability to improve graphics, letting older PlayStation titles run at a higher resolution than the original hardware. Sony responded with an onslaught of lawsuits. They accused Bleem of copyright infringement and unfair competition. But just like with Connectix, the courts didn't side with Sony. Judges ruled that Bleem had legally reverse engineered the system and that using screenshots of PlayStation games in their marketing counted as fair use. Legally, Bleem kept winning. But winning in court doesn't always mean survival. Sony dragged out the legal process for years, forcing Bleem to spend enormous amounts on defense. By 2001, the company shut down. Not because they lost, but because they couldn't keep fighting. The Bleem saga showed how big corporations could still crush smaller innovators, even without winning a ruling. It's remembered as a legal victory for emulation, but also as a cautionary tale about the cost of going up against a giant like Sony. Nintendo versus Blockbuster. By 1989, Nintendo had conquered living rooms, and Blockbuster was exploding as America's rental giant. Renting NES games gave family access to the entire library without buying full-price cartridges, and Nintendo wasn't happy. But in the US, the law allowed video game rentals. Unlike Japan, where Nintendo successfully lobbied to ban rentals, they couldn't stop the practice outright. So they attacked from a different angle, the instruction manuals. When Blockbuster rented games, manuals often went missing. To fix this, employees photocopied originals to include with cartridges. Nintendo saw this as a blatant copyright infringement. In May 1989, they sued Blockbuster, claiming the chain was illegally reproducing copyrighted material. This wasn't about the cartridges. It was about the paper booklets. Blockbuster quickly backed down. In court, they agreed to stop photocopying manuals and later reached a settlement with Nintendo. From then on, Blockbuster either supplied the original manuals or created its own legally distinct versions. Rentals continued, but the lawsuit sent a clear warning. Nintendo would fight to protect every piece of its property, no matter how small. This case didn't stop Blockbuster's rise, but it proved that even a simple manual could become a centerpiece of a courtroom battle. Atari versus Nintendo. By the early 1990s, Nintendo held an iron grip on the home console market. Their NES licensing agreement forced developers into strict contracts, often limiting them to just 5 games a year and requiring exclusivity. To competitors like Atari, this looked less like a smart business and more like a monopoly. In 1992, Atari Games filed a lawsuit accusing Nintendo of antitrust violations. Their claim was that Nintendo's lockout chip and licensing practices effectively shut rivals out of the market. Atari argued that Nintendo's control stifled competition and crushed systems like the Atari 7800 and Lynx before they had a chance. But in court, Atari couldn't convince the jury. After a lengthy trial, the verdict went to Nintendo. Atari's antitrust claims were rejected. Instead of damages for Atari, the tables turned. By 1994, after years of legal battles, Atari and Nintendo reached a broader settlement. Reports indicate Atari ultimately had to pay Nintendo to resolve outstanding claims and secure licensing rights, not the other way around. This case revealed just how powerful Nintendo was at the time. Atari tried to break the monopoly through the courts, but ended up weakening further, while Nintendo marched into the 1990s virtually untouched. Microsoft versus Immersion. When Microsoft entered the console market with the original Xbox in 2001, they leaned heavily on rumble feedback in the controller, a feature gamers had grown to love. But in 2002, a small company called Immersion filed a lawsuit claiming both Microsoft and Sony had infringed on its vibration technology patents. Immersion had been developing haptic feedback long before it became standard, and now they wanted compensation. Microsoft initially prepared for a long legal battle, but quickly changed course. In 2003, they reached a settlement, paying Immersion around $26 million to resolve the case. It wasn't just a payout. Microsoft also bought a stake in Immersion, essentially turning a lawsuit into a business partnership. This clever move meant that instead of fighting for years, Microsoft secured access to the technology while avoiding future courtroom headaches. Sony, however, decided not to settle, dragging the fight on for several more years. That decision would come back to haunt them. Meanwhile, Microsoft walked away relatively unscathed. Their controllers continued to feature rumble without disruption. This case showed how legal battles over patents could shape console design. Sometimes settling quickly isn't admitting defeat. It's buying a peace of mind and staying ahead in the game. Sony versus Immersion. Unlike Microsoft, Sony refused to settle when Immersion came after them in 2002 over rumble patents. At the time, Sony's DualShock controllers were iconic, but Immersion claimed that the technology behind the vibration motors were patented under their name. Sony argued that Immersion's claims were overly broad and that rumble had become an industry standard. The courts didn't buy it. In 2004, Sony was ordered to pay $90 million in damages and had to halt sales of the DualShock controller in the US for a brief period. The fallout even reached the launch of the PlayStation 3 in 2006. Early PS3 controllers shipped without rumble support, branded instead as 6-axis, which focused on motion control. Sony publicly downplayed the feature, claiming rumble was last gen. Gamers weren't convinced, and the absence became a sticking point. Eventually, Sony caved. In 2007, they settled with Immersion, paying additional licensing fees and securing the rights to reintroduce rumble. The DualShock 3 soon replaced the 6-axis, bringing the feature back where it belonged. This case was a financial hit and a PR headache, showing how one patent dispute could alter a flagship console launch. For Sony, it was a costly reminder that ignoring a lawsuit can reshape hardware itself. Few console controversies have haunted Nintendo like Joy-Con drift. When the Switch launched in 2017, players praised its detachable controllers, but by 2019, complaints poured in. Analog sticks were registering phantom movement when even being untouched. The defect made precision gaming frustrating, and in some cases, unplayable. Class action lawsuits soon hit Nintendo in the US, led by firms arguing that the Joy-Cons were sold with a known design flaw. More suits followed in Canada and Europe, while consumer groups accused Nintendo of violating basic product safety and warranty laws. Investigations pointed to the premature wear and the joystick control pad as the root cause. Nintendo responded by offering free repairs even outside of warranties, but critics argued that didn't solve the bigger issue, that the flaw remained baked into the hardware. The problem also extended to the Switch Lite, where non-removable controls made repairs trickier. In 2023, after heavy pressure from the European Consumer Organization, BEUC, Nintendo expanded its policy. It now offers free repair for Joy-Con drifts across the European Economic Area, even after standard legal guarantee expires. The lawsuits are still active, but the damage is done. Drift has become shorthand for Nintendo's most persistent modern hardware failure. Which lawsuit surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.